Sometimes the cruelest moments can lead to unexpected blessings. In a dusty frontier town where laughter came at others' expense, poor cowboy Ezra found himself at the center of the townspeople's worst joke yet. They dressed him in his only clean shirt, dragged him to the church, and forced him to marry a stubborn donkey named Belle in front of the whole town. What started as humiliation became something no one expected. Through harsh winters and lonely trails, Ezra and Belle became true companions, proving that friendship can bloom anywhere. But can a bond forged in cruel mockery really teach an entire town about true loyalty? Before we jump back in tonight, tell us where you're tuning in from around the world tonight, and if this heartfelt story of unexpected friendship truly touches your heart. Please make sure you're subscribed right now, because tomorrow I've saved something truly extra special just for you. The sun had barely kissed the horizon when Ezra Thornfield stepped out of his weathered cabin, the morning air carrying the familiar scent of sage and dust that had defined his life for the past 32 years. His boots, worn thin from countless miles of hard ground, crunched softly on the dried earth as he made his way toward the small corral where his few remaining cattle stood waiting. The pocket watch in his vest, his father's watch, the only thing of value he still owned, ticked steadily against his chest, a constant reminder of better days that felt like someone else's memory. Ezra had once been different. 20 years ago, he'd owned a proper ranch, spread across 200 acres of prime grazing land just outside of Millbrook Township. His cattle had been fat and healthy, his horses strong and sure-footed. The townspeople had tipped their hats when he rode through Main Street, and Martha Connolly had looked at him with eyes full of promise during Sunday church services. But drought had taken his grass, disease had claimed his herd, and the bank had seized his land with the cold efficiency of men who'd never felt dirt under their fingernails or watched a favorite horse struggle to breathe its last breath. Now, he lived in a one-room cabin on the outskirts of town, a place where the respectable folks rarely ventured. His morning routine never varied. Check on his 3 remaining steers, mend whatever fence the wind had damaged overnight, and count the coins in his coffee tin to see if he could afford both coffee and beans at Hartley's General Store. Most days it was one or the other. The town of Millbrook had changed too, though not from hardship. Gold had been discovered in the hills 20 miles north, and suddenly the sleepy farming community had swollen with prospectors, gamblers, and entrepreneurs looking to profit from other men's dreams. The newcomers brought money and noise and a particular brand of entertainment that often came at someone else's expense. They gathered in the Brass Lantern Saloon most evenings, swapping stories about the fortunes they'd surely find tomorrow, while pointing fingers at folks like Ezra and laughing about how the mighty had fallen. Ezra pulled his father's watch from his pocket and checked the time. 7:15. The morning ritual of feeding his cattle would take another hour, then he'd ride into town to see if anyone needed day labor. His back ached from sleeping on the thin mattress he'd fashioned from old saddle blankets, but complaining was a luxury he couldn't afford. The watch face caught the early sunlight, its silver surface tarnished but still beautiful. His father had carried it through 3 years of war, then 20 years of honest ranching. It had never missed a day of keeping perfect time, even when everything else in Ezra's life had fallen apart. "Morning, boys," he murmured to the steers, running his hand along the neck of the largest one, a red-brown animal he'd named Buck. These 3 were all that remained of a herd that had once numbered over 200 head. He'd refused offers to sell them, knowing that once they were gone, he'd have nothing left but memories and debt. They represented his last connection to the man he'd once been. The fence along the north side of the corral had worked loose again during the night. Ezra retrieved his hammer and a handful of nails from the small tool shed and began the familiar work of mending. The rhythmic sound of hammer against nail had become a meditation of sorts, each strike a small act of defiance against the forces trying to push him down. He'd been fixing this same section of fence every few weeks for the past 2 years, but He kept fixing it because that's what a man did. You tended to what was yours, even when it seemed like everything was working against you. As he worked, his mind drifted to Martha Connolly, now Martha Henderson, married to the bank president's son and living in the finest house on Elm Street. She'd stopped acknowledging him altogether after his ranch failed, crossing to the other side of the street when she saw him coming. He didn't blame her, not really. A woman had to think about her future, and Ezra represented a past that everyone had preferred to forget. The sound of hooves on packed earth drew his attention to the road. 3 riders approached, men he recognized from the saloon. Prospectors who'd struck a decent claim but hadn't learned the wisdom that comes with real hardship. They slowed their horses as they passed, the leader calling out with the kind of cheerful mockery that men used when they wanted to feel superior. "Morning, Thornfield. Still playing rancher with them 3 head of cattle." Ezra straightened but didn't respond. He'd learned that engaging with such talk only encouraged it. "Maybe we should buy them steers off you," the second rider added. "Save you the embarrassment of calling yourself a cattleman." The third man, youngest of the 3, laughed loudly. "Hell, he probably can't afford to feed them much longer anyway. Look at that fence, held together with prayer and stubbornness." They rode on, their laughter carrying on the morning breeze. Ezra returned to his mending, but the familiar ache of humiliation settled in his chest. He'd grown accustomed to such treatment over the years, but it never stopped stinging. The townspeople had divided him into a category separate from themselves, a cautionary tale about what happened when a man's luck ran out. After securing the fence, Ezra saddled his horse, a 15-year-old mare named Patience. She was gentle and reliable, though her best days were clearly behind her. Like her owner, she'd learned to make do with less and keep moving forward anyway. The ride into town took 20 minutes. Plenty of time for Ezra to practice the quiet. Dignity he'd cultivated over the years of reduced circumstances. Millbrook's main street bustled with the kind of activity that gold brought to a place. Wagons loaded with mining equipment rumbled past, while men in dusty clothes and hopeful expressions examined picks and shovels in the hardware store window. The Brass Lantern Saloon was already serving breakfast to miners heading out for the day, and the sound of their rough conversations spilled onto the wooden sidewalks. Ezra tied Patience to the rail outside Hartley's general store and stepped inside, the familiar smell of coffee, leather, and tobacco greeting him. Old Pete Hartley looked up from behind the counter, his weathered face showing the polite distance he maintained with customers who might not have money for their purchases. "Morning, Ezra. What can I do for you?" "Looking for work, Pete. Anyone. Mention needing help today?" Pete scratched his grey beard thoughtfully. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned she needs someone to repair her back porch steps. Seems her regular handyman is busy with a bigger job." The irony wasn't lost on Ezra. Martha's husband could afford to hire someone else for a simple repair job, while Ezra stood hat in hand, hoping for day labor. But work was work, and pride was a luxury he'd given up along with everything else. "I'll head over there directly. What's she paying?" $2 for the job. You'll need to provide your own materials. $2 minus the cost of lumber wood. Leave him with maybe enough for coffee and beans, assuming the repair didn't require more wood than he estimated. Ezra nodded his thanks and turned to leave, already calculating how he'd stretch his remaining coins to cover both the materials and his week's groceries. The sun climbed higher as he made his way to the Henderson house, his father's watch marking the steady passage of time. In a few hours, he'd have earned enough to eat for another few days. Tomorrow he'd wake before dawn and begin the same routine again. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he had, and he'd learned that a man could find dignity in any honest work if he approached it with the right spirit. As he reached the Hendersons' front gate, Ezra touched the pocket watch through his vest. His father had taught him that a man's character wasn't measured by his circumstances, but by how he conducted himself within those circumstances. Today, like every day for the past 10 years, Ezra would prove himself worthy of that lesson. 3 weeks after fixing Martha Henderson's porch steps, Ezra found himself in the middle of Main Street with a crowd gathered around him, their faces bright with the kind of anticipation that usually preceded somebody's misfortune. He'd been heading to the blacksmith shop to inquire about work when Jimmy Morrison and 2 of his drinking companions had intercepted him, their grins carrying the particular malice of men who'd found themselves a new source of entertainment. "Hold on there, Thornfield," Jimmy called out, his voice carrying across the street loud enough to draw attention from the shopkeepers and their customers. "We've got a proposition for you." Ezra slowed his pace but didn't stop. He'd learned that engaging with Jimmy Morrison rarely led anywhere good. The man had arrived from San Francisco 6 months earlier with more money than sense, and a disposition that seemed to require regular doses of other people's discomfort to maintain his good spirits. "Not interested, Morrison. Now, don't be hasty." Jimmy stepped directly into Ezra's path, forcing him to stop. "See, we've been talking, and we think it's a shame that a man of your advanced years remains unmarried. A fellow needs companionship, especially when times are hard." The crowd that had been casually observing began to press closer, sensing entertainment. Ezra recognized most of the faces: shopkeepers, miners, even a few of the more respectable, townspeople who normally wouldn't associate with Jimmy's crowd, but seemed drawn by curiosity about what spectacle was about to unfold. "I'm fine on my own, thanks." "But that's where you're wrong," Jimmy's companion, a thick-set man named Dutch, interjected. "We've found you the perfect bride, someone who'll appreciate your circumstances and won't expect too much in the way of material comforts." The crowd tittered with anticipation. Ezra could feel the familiar heat of humiliation beginning to rise in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd survived worse than whatever Jimmy Morrison could devise. "Where is she?" Jimmy asked Dutch with theatrical curiosity. "Bring out the blushing bride." Dutch disappeared around the corner of the general store and returned leading a small grey donkey by a frayed rope halter. The animal moved reluctantly, her hooves dragging slightly in the dust, her ears flattened back in an expression that suggested she was no more pleased with the situation than Ezra. The halter around her neck was cracked leather, mended in several places with rough stitching, and her coat showed the dullness that came from inadequate feed and little care. "Meet Belle," Jimmy announced with a flourish. "She's a bit long in the tooth like yourself, and she's not much to look at, but she's available and she won't run off with someone more prosperous." The crowd erupted in laughter. Someone called out, "She's perfect for him." Another voice added, "About time Thornfield found someone in his own league." Ezra studied the donkey, noting the resignation in her dark eyes that mirrored something he recognized in himself. She was thin, her ribs visible beneath her winter coat, and there was a wariness in her posture that spoke of too many encounters with humans who viewed her as either a burden or a source of amusement. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Ezra asked, though he already suspected he wouldn't like the answer. "A wedding!" Jimmy clapped his hands together. "Right here, right now, we'll make it official. Reverend Phillips is in town, and I'm sure he'd be delighted to perform the ceremony for a small donation to the church building fund." "You can't be serious." "Deadly serious," Dutch assured him. "Think of it as a community service. You get a companion who won't judge your circumstances, and Belle here gets a home where she won't be sold to the glue factory." The mention of the glue factory sent a chill through the crowd's laughter. Everyone knew that old or injured animals often met that fate when their owners could no longer afford to keep them. Dutch's implication was clear: participate in this farce, or watch the donkey meet an unpleasant end. Ezra looked at Belle again. She stood perfectly still now, as if she understood that her fate was being decided by creatures she had no reason to trust. There was intelligence in her eyes, and something else, a kind of patient endurance that reminded him uncomfortably of his own reflection in the mirror each morning. "And if I refuse?" Jimmy shrugged with exaggerated indifference. "Well, Belle here will have to be sold to cover her feed bills. Shame to see a good animal go to waste, but business is business." Reverend Phillips had indeed appeared at the edge of the crowd, drawn by the commotion. He was a young man, new to the territory, and his expression suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation, but lacked the authority or confidence to intervene on moral grounds. "What do you say, Reverend?" Jimmy called out. "Will you help a lonely man find companionship?" The Reverend fidgeted with his collar. "Well, I suppose if it's a ceremony of sorts, meant in the spirit of—" "It's settled then," Jimmy interrupted. "Ezra Thornfield, do you take this donkey to be your lawfully wedded companion, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, with more arriving every moment. Ezra could see Martha Henderson watching from across the street, her face a mixture of embarrassment and pity. Pete Hartley stood in his doorway, shaking his head, but making no move to intervene. Even the children had gathered, their young faces bright with the thrill of witnessing something unprecedented. Belle shifted slightly, drawing Ezra's attention back to her. She was watching him now, her head tilted, as if she were trying to understand the human behavior unfolding around her. There was no fear in her expression, only a kind of weary acceptance that suggested she'd learned not to expect much from the world, but had somehow retained hope that things might occasionally surprise her. "I do," Ezra said quietly. The crowd cheered as if they'd witnessed something genuinely celebratory rather than an act of public humiliation. Jimmy produced a crude marriage certificate he'd apparently prepared in advance, complete with spaces for signatures and witnesses. Dutch tied Belle's lead rope loosely around Ezra's wrist in a gesture meant to symbolize their union. "You may kiss the bride," Jimmy announced, provoking another wave of laughter. Ezra ignored the suggestion and instead reached out to touch Belle's neck gently. She didn't pull away, and he could feel the steady rhythm of her pulse beneath the warm fur. There was something oddly comforting about that simple contact, the recognition of one living creature acknowledging another without judgment or expectation. "Congratulations," the Reverend said weakly, clearly uncomfortable with his role in the proceedings. "May you find happiness together." As the crowd began to disperse, returning to their shops and daily business with the satisfied air of people who'd witnessed a memorable entertainment, Ezra found himself alone with Belle in the middle of Main Street. The rope around his wrist felt less like a symbol of mockery and more like a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but couldn't abandon. "Well, Belle," he said softly, "I suppose we're stuck with each other now." She turned her head to look at him directly, and for a moment Ezra could swear he saw understanding in her dark eyes. Whatever this was, joke, ceremony, or simple cruelty, they were in it together now. And perhaps, he thought, as he began walking toward home with his new companion following behind, there was more than either of them had had before this strange day began. The morning after what the town had taken to calling Thornfield's wedding, Ezra woke to find Belle standing outside his cabin window, her breath creating small clouds in the crisp air. She'd spent the night in his small corral with the 3 steers, though she'd positioned herself as far from them as the space allowed. Now she watched him through the glass with an expression that seemed both expectant and patient, as if she understood that their unusual circumstances required some adjustment from both parties. Ezra dressed slowly, his joints protesting the cold, and the thin mattress that had never been adequate for a man his size. The mockery of the previous day sat heavy in his chest, but as he looked out at Belle, he felt something unexpected, a sense of responsibility that went beyond mere obligation. She was depending on him now, whether either of them had chosen it or not. He stepped outside, and Belle turned to face him fully, her ears pricked forward in what he was beginning to recognize as her version of polite attention. She was smaller than he'd initially thought, probably no more than 3 feet at the shoulder, but there was a sturdiness to her build that suggested she'd been bred for work rather than show. "Morning, Belle," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "I suppose you're hungry." He'd given her some of the hay he'd been saving for his cattle, but it wasn't much. and her thin condition suggested she needed better feed than she'd been getting. Ezra walked to his small feed shed and measured out portions for all 4 animals, noting that his supplies would run short faster now, with an additional mouth to feed. As he distributed the hay, Belle approached cautiously. Unlike his cattle, who pushed forward eagerly for their breakfast, she waited until he'd moved away before beginning to eat. Her table manners, Ezra observed with some amusement, were considerably better than those of her bovine companions. The sound of approaching horses drew his attention to the road. 2 riders were coming up the path to his cabin, men he didn't recognize, which meant they were likely prospectors or drifters passing through. They reined in at the fence and called out a greeting. "Morning. You Ezra Thornfield?" "I am." Ezra walked closer to the fence, noting that both men wore the practical clothes of experienced travelers rather than the flashy gear that marked newcomers to the territory. "Name's Jake Sullivan," the older of the 2 said. He was perhaps 40, with graying hair and the weathered skin of a man who'd spent most of his life outdoors. "This here's my partner, Tom Reed. We heard in town that you might be looking for work." Ezra glanced at Belle, who had stopped eating to observe the strangers with alert interest. "What kind of work?" "We've got a contract to deliver a herd of cattle to Denver," Tom explained. He was younger than Sullivan, but carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd proven himself capable in difficult circumstances. 200 head. The owner's willing to pay good money for experienced cowboys, and we heard you used to run cattle yourself. The offer was tempting. Denver was a 3-week journey by cattle drive, and the pay would be enough to keep him fed through the winter with money left over to improve his small operation. But he looked at Belle again, who was watching the conversation with obvious interest and felt the weight of his new responsibility. "When would you be leaving?" "Day after tomorrow. We're gathering the herd now, and we'd like to be on the trail before the weather turns bad." 3 weeks away meant leaving Belle behind, and Ezra doubted the townspeople who'd arranged their marriage would take kindly to caring for her in his absence. More likely, they'd use his departure as an excuse to dispose of her, as they'd originally threatened. "I appreciate the offer," Ezra said slowly, "but I can't leave right now. I've got responsibilities here." Sullivan looked around the small property with its modest cabin and meager corral. "What responsibilities? This place will still be here when you get back, and the money would help you improve it considerably. I have animals that depend on me." Tom laughed not unkindly. 3 head of cattle and a donkey. Hell, any of your neighbors could look after them for a few weeks. But Ezra knew his neighbors better than these strangers did. The mock wedding had been entertainment for them, not the beginning of any genuine concern for his welfare or that of his animals. Belle had become his responsibility, and abandoning her now would make him no better than the people who'd used her as a prop for their amusement. "Thanks for thinking of me," Ezra said, "but I can't leave." The 2 men exchanged glances, clearly puzzled by his refusal. Good-paying work was scarce, and most men in his circumstances would jump at the opportunity. They touched their hats politely and rode away, leaving Ezra alone with his animals and his thoughts. Belle had resumed eating, but she kept glancing in his direction as if she'd understood something significant had just occurred. Ezra found himself studying her more carefully, noting details he'd missed during the commotion of the previous day. Her coat, while dull from poor nutrition, showed traces of the soft grey that would emerge with proper care. Her hooves were well-shaped and hard, suggesting she was sound despite her neglected appearance. Most importantly, there was an alertness in her manner that indicated intelligence and curiosity about her surroundings. After the animals finished eating, Ezra decided to take Belle for a walk to assess her condition and temperament. He fashioned a simple lead rope and was surprised when she followed willingly, matching her pace to his without pulling or lagging behind. They walked the perimeter of his property, Belle investigating various bushes and rocks with the thoroughness of someone exploring a new home. At the far corner of his land, where a small creek provided water for his cattle, Belle stopped and looked out toward the hills that marked the beginning of the vast wilderness beyond Millbrook. Her ears were pricked forward, and there was something in her posture that reminded Ezra of his own younger self, when he dreamed of expanding his ranch and exploring the territories that lay beyond the familiar boundaries of home. He pulled his old trail map from his pocket, a hand-drawn guide to water sources and cattle routes that his father had created years earlier. The paper was soft with age and use, marked with notes about seasonal grazing areas and hazards to avoid. Looking at it now, Ezra realized there were paths marked on that map that he'd never explored, places where a man and his animals might find opportunities that didn't exist in towns where people had already decided what you were worth. Belle nudged, his elbow gently drawing his attention back to the present. She was looking at him with those dark, intelligent eyes, and Ezra found himself wondering what she might be thinking. Whatever it was, he sensed that she was as ready for change as he was beginning to be. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a cold snap that caught everyone unprepared. Ezra woke one morning to find frost covering his windows and Belle standing closer to the cabin than usual, her breath creating steady puffs of vapor in the frigid air. His supply of firewood, adequate for heating one small room, would be stretched thin if he wanted to keep the animals' water from freezing. Over the past 2 weeks, Belle had established her own routines around the property. She grazed near the cattle during the day, but maintained her distance from them, as if she understood she was different and didn't want to impose. In the evenings, she positioned herself where she could see both the cabin and the road, alert to any approaching visitors. Ezra had come to appreciate her watchfulness. She always knew when someone was coming long before he heard hoofbeats on the trail. The mockery from town had died down somewhat, replaced by a kind of grudging curiosity about how long the arrangement would last. A few townspeople had made bets about whether Ezra would abandon his bride before Christmas, but most had moved on to other entertainments. The novelty of his situation had worn off, leaving him and Belle to work out the practical details of their shared existence. Those details proved more complex than Ezra had anticipated. Belle was clearly accustomed to poor treatment. She flinched when he moved too quickly and kept her distance when other people approached. But she was also remarkably intelligent, learning the daily routine of feeding and watering with an efficiency that put his cattle to shame. More surprisingly, she seemed to enjoy having tasks to perform. One morning, when Ezra was struggling to carry enough firewood to last through a particularly cold day, Belle appeared at his side and began pushing the smaller pieces of wood toward the cabin with her nose. At first, he thought it was coincidental, but when she repeated the behavior the next day, he realized she was genuinely trying to help. By the end of the week, she was carrying small bundles of kindling in a canvas sack he'd rigged across her back, her contribution to their shared survival. The cold weather also revealed Belle's vulnerability to the elements. Her thin coat provided little insulation, and she shivered visibly during the worst of the morning frosts. Ezra found himself checking on her more frequently, bringing her into the small lean-to attached to his cabin during the coldest nights. She seemed grateful for the shelter, though she always positioned herself where she could see outside, as if maintaining watch even while resting. It was during one of these cold nights that Ezra discovered Belle's most remarkable quality. He'd been awakened by the sound of his cattle moving restlessly in the corral, their low calls suggesting some kind of distress. When he looked outside, he could see Belle standing alert near the fence, her attention focused on something in the darkness beyond his property. Ezra grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, the cold air sharp in his lungs. Belle turned to look at him, then back toward whatever had caught her attention. He followed her gaze and spotted the reflection of eyes in the moonlight, wolves, at least 3 of them, testing the perimeter of his small ranch. The wolves were thin, driven down from the mountains by the early cold and attracted by the scent of his cattle. Under normal circumstances, 3 steers would be easy prey for a pack, but Belle had positioned herself between the predators and the cattle, her small body bristling with protective energy. When one of the wolves moved closer, she let out a sound Ezra had never heard from a donkey before, a harsh, challenging bray that carried clearly through the night air. Ezra fired a warning shot into the air, and the wolves melted back into the darkness, but he remained outside for another hour, watching and listening. Belle stayed at her post the entire time, her ears swiveling to catch any sound that might indicate the predator's return. Only when Ezra was convinced they were gone did she relax her vigilance and return to the shelter of the lean-to. The next morning brought news that 2 neighboring properties had lost livestock to wolf attacks during the night. Ezra's cattle remained unharmed, and he knew he had Belle to thank for their safety. The realization prompted him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about his unusual companion. That afternoon, he rode into town to purchase supplies, taking Belle with him for the first time since their wedding day. The reaction from the townspeople was mixed. Some pointed and laughed as expected, but others watched with curiosity as Belle walked calmly beside Patience, matching the horses' pace without pulling on the lead rope or showing any sign of distress at the noise and activity of Main Street. At Hartley's general store, Pete emerged to observe Belle's behavior firsthand. "She's well-mannered," he admitted grudgingly. "Most donkeys are stubborn as sin, but she seems to have sense." "More sense than some people I know," Ezra replied, loading supplies into his saddlebags, while Belle waited patiently beside the hitching post. "Heard you turned down good work with the Sullivan outfit." "I did." Pete studied him for a moment. "That was foolish, Ezra. Winter's coming and you need the money. I have responsibilities here." "To a donkey?" Pete's tone suggested he thought Ezra might have lost his reason entirely. Ezra looked at Belle, who was watching their conversation with alert interest. "To a friend," he corrected quietly. That evening, as he prepared his simple dinner over the campfire outside his cabin, Belle approached closer than usual. On impulse, Ezra offered her a small portion of the beans he'd cooked in his dented tin pot. She accepted the offering delicately, and they shared the meal in comfortable silence, the warmth of the fire creating a circle of light in the growing darkness. As the flames died down to embers, Belle settled nearby, close enough that Ezra could hear her steady breathing, but far enough away to maintain the respectful distance she preferred. Looking at her in the firelight, he realized that somewhere in the past few weeks, the burden of caring for an unwanted animal had transformed into something else entirely, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared survival. The townspeople might continue to view their arrangement as a joke, but Ezra was beginning to understand that what had started as cruelty might become the foundation of the most honest relationship he'd ever experienced. December brought the kind of snow that made even optimistic men wonder if spring would ever return. Ezra had been splitting wood behind his cabin when Belle appeared beside him, her dark eyes fixed on something in the distance. Following her gaze, he spotted a lone rider approaching through the falling snow, moving slowly and deliberately along the rutted path that served as his driveway. The visitor was Martha Henderson, bundled in a heavy coat and riding side-saddle, on a well-groomed mare. She reined in near the woodpile and sat for a moment, her breath creating clouds in the cold air as she seemed to gather courage for whatever had brought her to his door. "Martha," Ezra said, setting down his axe. "This is unexpected." She dismounted carefully, her movements suggesting she wasn't accustomed to riding in such weather. Belle watched the proceedings with polite interest, positioned where she could observe both the visitor and the road beyond. "May I speak with you privately?" Martha asked, glancing at Belle as if unsure whether the donkey's presence violated the privacy she sought. "Belle's fine where she is," Ezra replied. "She doesn't repeat conversations." Martha's smile was strained, but she nodded. "I suppose that's true." She paused, clearly struggling with how to begin. "Ezra, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." He studied her face, noting the lines that hadn't been there 20 years ago when they'd walked out together after church services. For what? For not speaking up when those men humiliated you in town, for crossing the street to avoid you all these years, for being the kind of person who lets fear dictate kindness. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind. I've watched you these past weeks, and I'm ashamed of how I've behaved. Ezra glanced at Belle, who had moved closer during the conversation, perhaps sensing the emotional weight of the exchange. You made choices that seemed right for your circumstances. Can't fault you for that. Yes, I can fault me for that, Martha said with surprising firmness. And I have been, every day since watching you walk home with that donkey while the whole town laughed. You showed more dignity in that moment than the rest of us had shown in years. The wind picked up, sending snow spiraling around them. Ezra gestured toward the cabin. Come inside where it's warmer. We can talk properly. Martha hesitated, clearly aware of the impropriety of entering a bachelor's home, but the cold won out, over convention. She followed him inside, with Belle trailing behind and settling near the door, where she could monitor both the conversation and any activity outside. The cabin's single room was spartanly furnished, but scrupulously clean. A bed in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove that provided both heat and cooking surface. Martha took in the modest surroundings without comment, though her expression suggested she was comparing it to the comfortable home she shared with her banker husband. Coffee, Ezra offered, though he knew his supplies were running low. Please. As he prepared the coffee, Martha examined the few personal items he'd kept from better days. A photograph of his family's ranch in its prime, his father's war medals in a small wooden box, a Bible with worn leather binding. She picked up the photograph, studying the image of prosperous buildings and healthy cattle. I remember when this was taken, she said softly. You were so proud of what you'd built. Different times. Do you ever think about rebuilding? Starting over somewhere else? Ezra poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to Martha. Been thinking about it more lately, actually. She looked surprised. Really? What changed your mind? He glanced at Belle, who was resting near the door, but clearly listening to every word. Sometimes it takes a partner to help you see possibilities you'd given up on. Martha followed his gaze and seemed to truly look at Belle for the first time. She's not what I expected. What did you expect? A broken-down old animal? Something as defeated as... She stopped herself, but the implication hung in the air between them. As defeated as me? Martha's cheeks reddened, though whether from embarrassment or the cabin's warmth was unclear. I'm sorry. I didn't mean... It's all right. That's what everyone expected, including me. Ezra sat across from her at the small table. But Belle's got more fight in her than anyone gave her credit for. Makes you reconsider what else you might have misjudged. They drank their coffee in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the crackling of wood in the stove and Belle's occasional shifting near the door. Finally, Martha spoke again. Charles is worried about you. Charles. Ezra couldn't hide his surprise. Charles Henderson had never shown concern for his welfare before. He heard you turn down work with the cattle drive. Good money, from what Jake Sullivan said. Charles thinks you might be... She paused, searching for diplomatic words. That recent events might have affected your judgment. The implication was clear enough. The bank president's son thought Ezra had lost his mind, choosing a donkey's company over practical opportunities for financial improvement. It was probably a reasonable assessment from someone who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. What do you think? Ezra asked. Martha considered the question seriously, her eyes moving from Ezra to Belle and back again. I think you're the first person in this town to keep a promise, even when that promise was made as a joke at your expense. Belle raised her head at the sound of her name, and Martha extended her hand toward the donkey hesitantly. Belle approached cautiously and allowed Martha to stroke her neck, responding to the gentle touch with evident pleasure. She's beautiful, Martha said with genuine surprise. Her coat is getting thicker. Better feed, Ezra explained. She was half-starved when they brought her to town. Who owned her before? Jimmy Morrison bought her from a farmer who was getting rid of livestock he couldn't afford to keep. Far as I can tell, nobody's shown her kindness in years. Martha continued petting Belle's neck, and the donkey leaned into the attention like a cat seeking affection. She trusts you. Took a while. She's been disappointed by humans before. Haven't we all? Martha murmured. She was quiet for a long moment, then looked at Ezra directly. Charles offered me money to bring to you. He thought you might be too proud to accept charity directly, but that you'd take it from an old friend. Ezra felt the familiar heat of humiliation, but it was followed immediately by something new, a protective anger on Belle's behalf as much as his own. What did you tell him? I told him that a man who keeps faith with a donkey probably doesn't need lessons in dignity from someone who's never had his honor tested. The strength in her voice surprised them both. Belle looked up at Martha with what seemed like approval, and Ezra found himself reassessing the woman he'd thought he'd known. Charles wasn't happy with that answer, Martha continued. He's concerned about his reputation, having his wife associated with someone the town considers a fool. Different. Outside, the snow was falling harder, and the wind rattled the cabin's single window. Martha glanced toward the door, clearly aware that she needed to return home before the weather made travel impossible. I should go, she said reluctantly. But Ezra, if you do decide to start over somewhere else, you shouldn't let other people's opinions hold you back. Some of us have been wrong about a great many things. The blizzard that followed Martha's visit lasted 3 days, trapping Ezra and his animals in a world of white silence. By the second day, he'd moved Belle permanently into the lean-to attached to his cabin, sharing the space with his dwindling supply of firewood and the emergency provisions he'd learned to keep for exactly such emergencies. She seemed grateful for the shelter, though she maintained her vigilant watch through the gaps in the walls, alert to any sounds that might indicate trouble. During the long hours of confinement, Ezra found himself talking to Belle more than he'd spoken aloud in months. At first it felt foolish, addressing observations about the weather or plans for the spring to an animal who couldn't respond. But Belle was an attentive listener, her ears following the sound of his voice, her dark eyes focused on his face, as if she were following every word. More importantly, talking helped organize his thoughts about the future that was taking shape in his mind. Been thinking about what Martha said, he told Belle on the evening of the second day, as they shared the warmth of a small fire he'd built in a metal bucket for safety. About starting over somewhere else. Belle was lying near the fire, her legs tucked beneath her, in a position that reminded Ezra of a large dog. She raised her head when he spoke, giving him the kind of focused attention that encouraged conversation. My father used to say that a man's character isn't defined by his circumstances, but by how he responds to them. Ezra retrieved a small wooden box from among his few possessions and opened it carefully. Inside, nestled among his father's war medals, was a simple wooden cross, no larger than his thumb, carved from a piece of oak. Belle showed interest in the object, extending her neck to examine it more closely. Ezra held it where she could see it clearly. He made this during the war, whittling it from a piece of wood he found after a particularly bad battle. Said it reminded him that even when everything seemed hopeless, there was still reason to believe in something better. Ezra turned the cross over in his hands, noting the careful attention to detail despite its small size. He carried it through. 3 more years of fighting, then 20 years of ranching. It was in his pocket when he died. The wind howled outside, rattling the lean-to's walls, but inside their small shelter, the fire provided a circle of warmth and light. Belle settled her head on her front legs, but her eyes remained fixed on Ezra's face, as if she understood the importance of what he was sharing. I stopped believing in better possibilities after I lost the ranch, Ezra continued. Started thinking, maybe some folks are just meant to struggle, that there's no point in hoping for more than survival. He looked at Belle, who was still watching him intently. But then you came along and I realized I'd been wrong about what matters. Belle blinked slowly, a gesture that seemed somehow encouraging. See, Everyone expected you to be just another burden, something worthless that would make my life even harder. But you've made it better in ways I couldn't have imagined." Ezra paused, struck by the truth of his words. "You work without being forced to. You watch over the cattle like they're your own. You warn me when there's danger. You've never once tried to run away, even though nobody would blame you if you did." The fire crackled, sending small sparks up toward the roof of the lean-to. Belle shifted slightly, moving closer to Ezra without seeming to realize she was doing it. "Makes me wonder what other things I've been wrong about," Ezra said. "Maybe the problem isn't that some people are meant to struggle. Maybe it's that they stop looking for the right kind of help." On the third morning, the wind finally died, and Ezra woke to the profound silence that follows a major storm. He pushed open the door of the lean-to and found himself looking out at a world transformed by snow. Drifts reached nearly to the roof in some places, and the familiar landmarks of his small property were buried beyond recognition. Belle appeared beside him, studying the changed landscape with obvious interest. She stepped carefully into the snow, testing its depth and consistency, then looked back at Ezra, as if asking for his assessment of the situation. "We'll need to dig out," he told her. "Check on the cattle, clear a path to the cabin, find the water trough under all this white." What followed was the most cooperative work Ezra had ever experienced with another creature. Belle seemed to understand the urgency of their situation and threw herself into the effort of snow removal with a determination that matched his own. She couldn't handle a shovel, but she could push snow with her broad chest and compact it with her hooves, creating pathways that Ezra could then widen and clear. The cattle had survived the storm by huddling together in the corner of the corral that offered the most protection from the wind. They were cold and hungry, but unharmed. As Ezra distributed hay, he noticed Belle positioning herself between the cattle and the direction from which the storm had come, as if she were still protecting them from threats, even though the immediate danger had passed. It took most of the day to restore basic functionality to the small ranch, and by evening both Ezra and Belle were exhausted. As they settled beside another small fire in the lean-to, sharing a simple meal of beans and hardtack, Ezra felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction that comes from working alongside someone who shares your commitment to getting the job done. "You know what I realized today?" he said to Belle, who was lying near the fire with her legs tucked beneath her in the position he'd come to recognize as her most relaxed posture. "This is the first time in 10 years I've felt like I had a real partner in anything important." Belle raised her head and looked at him directly, and Ezra was struck again by the intelligence in her dark eyes. "My father's cross reminds me that good things can come from bad situations," he continued, pulling the small wooden symbol from his pocket. "But I think you've taught me something even more important, that sometimes the good things are right. They're waiting for you to notice them. You just have to be willing to see past what everyone else thinks they're worth." Outside, the night was clear and cold, filled with the kind of silence that makes a person aware of their place in the larger world. Inside their small shelter, warmed by fire and companionship, Ezra felt something stirring that he'd almost forgotten how to recognize, hope for a future that might hold possibilities he hadn't yet imagined. The thaw came suddenly in late January, turning snow into rushing streams and revealing things that winter had hidden. Ezra was mucking out the lean-to when Belle's restlessness caught his attention. She paced near the back wall, pawing at something half buried in the hay and debris that had accumulated during the storm. Her behavior was unlike her usual calm demeanor. There was an urgency in her movements that suggested she'd discovered something significant. "What is it, girl?" Ezra asked, setting down his pitchfork to investigate. Belle stepped back as he approached, allowing him to see what had captured her attention. Partially buried beneath moldy hay was an old leather saddlebag, cracked and darkened with age. Ezra didn't recognize it, certainly nothing that belonged to him, but Belle's reaction suggested it was somehow connected to her. He lifted the saddlebag carefully, noting its weight and the quality of its construction. Despite its weathered condition, it had been well made originally, the kind of gear that would have been expensive when new. Belle watched intently as he examined it, her ears pricked forward with an alertness that confirmed his suspicion about its significance. The saddlebag's main compartment contained only debris and the remains of what might once have been food, supplies, but the smaller side pocket yielded something unexpected, a sealed oilskin pouch that had protected its contents from moisture and decay. Inside the pouch were 3 items: a faded photograph, a small leather journal, and a letter addressed in careful handwriting to "Whoever finds Belle." Ezra's hands trembled slightly as he opened the letter, aware that Belle was watching his every movement. The paper was of good quality, and the handwriting belonged to someone educated, a woman, he thought, based on the careful formation of the letters. "My name is Sarah McKinnon," the letter began. "And if you are reading this, then my beloved Belle has found someone who cares enough about her to investigate her past. I pray that person is you, and that you have shown her the kindness she deserves." Ezra glanced at Belle, who had moved closer and was observing the proceedings with remarkable intensity. He continued reading. "Belle is not just any donkey. She is the daughter of champion stock, bred for intelligence and loyalty rather than mere labor. Her mother was Spanish, her father from the finest bloodlines in Missouri. I raised her from birth, and she was my constant companion for 8 years before circumstances forced me to part with her. My husband died in a mining accident 2 years ago, leaving me with debts that consumed everything we owned. I tried to keep Belle, but the creditors would not be moved by sentiment. They sold her to a livestock trader who promised she would go to a good home, but I have since learned this was not the case. She has passed through several hands, none of whom understood her true nature or value. Belle is not merely intelligent. She is intuitive in ways that border on the mystical. She can sense storms hours before they arrive, knows when people are trustworthy, and has an uncanny ability to find her way across unfamiliar territory. During our time together, she saved my life on 3 separate occasions, once by alerting me to a rattlesnake I hadn't seen, once by refusing to cross a bridge that collapsed minutes later, and once by leading me to shelter during a sudden blizzard. More than her practical abilities, Belle possesses a capacity for loyalty and affection that humbles me. She mourned my husband's death as genuinely as I did, standing vigil beside his grave for 3 days without eating. When I finally had to say goodbye to her, she seemed to understand what was happening and made no attempt to follow me, though I could see in her eyes that she wanted to. If Belle has chosen to stay with you, and make no mistake, it is her choice, then you have been granted a gift beyond price. She does not give her trust easily, but once given, it is absolute. Treasure her as I did, and you will find that the bond between human and animal can transcend the ordinary limits of both species. There is one more thing you should know. In the photograph, you will see Belle as a young animal standing beside my husband and myself at our ranch. We called her Belle not for beauty, though she was beautiful, but because she possessed something even rarer, a beautiful soul. She was never meant for hard labor or neglect. She was meant for partnership with someone who could recognize her worth. I believe that person is you. Belle has always been able to choose her own companions, and she has chosen you. Trust in that choice, as I learned to trust in hers. With gratitude for your kindness to my dearest friend, Sarah McKinnon, written this day, September 15th, 1869. Ezra set the letter aside and examined the photograph with shaking hands. It showed a young woman and a bearded man standing in front of a well-built ranch house with a younger Belle, her coat gleaming with health and care, positioned between them like a beloved child. The resemblance to the Belle he knew was unmistakable, though the animal in the photograph radiated the confidence and contentment of a creature who had never known want or cruelty. The leather journal contained detailed records of Belle's lineage, training, and achievements. Sarah McKinnon had documented everything. Belle's ability to navigate complex terrain, her skill at detecting weather changes, her protective instincts, and most remarkably, her capacity for what Sarah had called emotional intelligence. The ability to sense human moods and respond appropriately. Belle nudged Ezra's elbow gently, drawing his attention back to her. Looking at her now, with this new knowledge, he could see traces of the noble bearing that good breeding and careful training had instilled. Her posture was naturally proud, her movements efficient and purposeful. Even her weathered halter couldn't disguise the quality of her conformation. "Sarah McKinnon," he said softly, and Belle's ears pricked forward at the sound of the name. "You remember her, don't you?" Belle stepped closer, close enough that Ezra could stroke her neck. As his hand made contact, he felt a subtle tremor run through her, as if the touch had awakened memories she'd kept carefully buried. Everything made sense now. Belle's intelligence, her loyalty, her protective instincts. The townspeople had used a creature of remarkable breeding and training as a prop for their cruel joke, never realizing they were mocking something far superior to themselves. Jimmy Morrison had purchased a champion and treated her like refuse, ignorant of what he'd acquired. But more than her breeding, the letter revealed something that transformed Ezra's understanding of their relationship. Belle hadn't simply accepted the situation forced on her. She had chosen him, just as Sarah McKinnon had written. Despite everything she'd endured, she had recognized something in Ezra that made her willing to trust again. The realization brought with it a profound sense of responsibility and purpose. This wasn't about a broken-down cowboy making do with whatever fate had handed him. This was about two beings of quality who had found each other despite circumstances designed to prevent exactly that discovery. Ezra looked at the trail map he'd been studying more frequently as winter wore on. Then at Belle, who was watching him with that familiar expression of intelligent patience. Sarah McKinnon's letter had confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. Belle was meant for more than surviving on the scraps of other people's charity. "She said you can find your way across unfamiliar territory," he told Belle, "and that you only stay with people you choose to trust." Belle tilted her head slightly, a gesture he'd come to recognize as her way of indicating close attention. "Well then," Ezra continued, folding the letter carefully and returning it to the oilskin pouch, "I suppose the question is whether you'd be willing to trust me enough to find out what we might accomplish together, away from people who never understood what either of us was worth." Belle moved closer still, resting her head against his shoulder in a gesture of such clear affection and acceptance that Ezra felt his throat tighten with emotion. For the first time in 10 years, he had a partner who had chosen him freely, and a purpose that extended beyond mere survival. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it brought with it a restlessness that Ezra recognized as the need for decisive action. The discovery of Sarah McKinnon's letter had crystallized thoughts that had been forming throughout the long winter months. He and Belle were meant for something more than scratching out an existence on the margins of a town that saw them as objects of amusement. The question was how to make the transition from their current circumstances to whatever lay ahead. The practical considerations were daunting. His 3 cattle represented his only liquid assets, but selling them would provide just enough money for basic supplies and perhaps a month's provisions. The cabin and small plot of land were his by right of occupation rather than legal ownership. He'd been squatting on abandoned property for so long that even the bank had forgotten about it. Leaving would mean starting over with virtually nothing, except Belle, and the knowledge that she was far more valuable than anyone in Millbrook realized. But staying meant accepting a slow decline into deeper poverty and continued humiliation. The townspeople might have grown bored with mocking his situation, but their underlying judgment remained unchanged. To them, he would always be the man who'd been forced to marry a donkey, and Belle would always be the unwanted animal that symbolized his fall from respectability. The decision crystallized on a morning in early March when Ezra rode into town to purchase supplies and found Jimmy Morrison holding court outside the Brass Lantern Saloon. Morrison was regaling a group of newer arrivals with the story of Ezra's wedding, embellishing the tale with each telling until it bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. "Funniest damn thing you ever saw," Morrison was saying, as Ezra tied Patience to the hitching post. Man was so desperate for companionship, he actually went through with the ceremony. Been living with that donkey ever since, talking to it like it understands English. The listeners laughed appropriately, though their amusement carried the edge of men who were grateful to have found someone lower than themselves in the social hierarchy. Ezra had intended to ignore the conversation and go about his business, but Morrison's next words stopped him cold. "Course, the joke's wearing thin now. Been thinking we should organize another entertainment, maybe a divorce ceremony this time. Get the preacher to dissolve the union so Thornfield can marry something more appropriate to his circumstances. Maybe a goat." The laughter that followed was louder and crueler than before. Ezra felt the familiar heat of humiliation rising in his chest, but it was accompanied by something new, a protective anger on Belle's behalf that surprised him with its intensity. These men were planning to humiliate not just him, but a creature of noble breeding who had survived neglect and mistreatment with more dignity than any of them possessed. That evening, as he shared his simple dinner with Belle beside the fire, Ezra made his decision. "We're leaving," he told her, noting how her ears pricked forward at the serious tone in his voice. "Can't say exactly where we're going yet, but we're not staying here to provide entertainment for people who wouldn't. No quality if it bit them." Belle moved closer, resting her head against his knee in a gesture that had become their signal of mutual understanding. Looking down at her in the firelight, Ezra could see traces of the magnificent animal Sarah McKinnon had described. Intelligent, loyal, capable of things that transcended the ordinary relationship between human and beast. Over the following weeks, Ezra began making quiet preparations for departure. He sold his cattle to a neighboring rancher for less than they were worth, but enough to fund their journey. He studied his father's trail maps more carefully, identifying routes that would take them away from settled areas where their unusual partnership might attract unwanted attention. Most importantly, he began training with Belle in earnest, drawing on the information he'd found in Sarah McKinnon's journal about her abilities and potential. What he discovered exceeded even his elevated expectations. Belle could indeed detect weather changes hours in advance, her behavior shifting in subtle ways that warned of approaching storms. She could navigate by landmarks invisible to human perception, seeming to possess an internal compass that never failed. Most remarkably, she demonstrated an intuitive understanding of his intentions that allowed them to work together with minimal verbal communication. During one practice session, Ezra deliberately took a wrong trail to test Belle's navigational abilities. Within minutes, she began showing signs of discomfort, pawing the ground and looking repeatedly in the direction they should have taken. When he finally allowed her to lead, she guided them directly to their intended destination by a route he hadn't known existed. "Sarah McKinnon was right about you," he told Belle as they made camp that evening. "You're something special. Question is, what are we going to do with that gift?" The answer came to him gradually over several more days of preparation and practice. They weren't just running away from Millbrook's mockery. They were moving toward something better, something that would allow Belle to fulfill the potential her breeding and training had prepared her for. The Western Territories were full of opportunities for a man with a reliable companion who possessed unusual abilities. Mining operations needed guides who could navigate treacherous terrain. Survey expeditions required animals capable of carrying equipment across difficult country. Ranchers paid good money for help in locating water sources and safe passage through unfamiliar territory. But before they could pursue any of those opportunities, there was one final matter to settle in Millbrook. The townspeople deserved to understand what they had mocked, if only to prevent them from making similar mistakes with other creatures or people who failed to meet their narrow definitions of worth. The plan formed slowly, born from equal parts, strategy and moral necessity. Sunday services at the community church drew nearly everyone in town, providing the perfect opportunity to address the entire community at once. The church bell that called people to worship would also serve to gather witnesses to the truth about Belle's real nature and the cruel ignorance that had characterized their treatment of both of them. Ezra spent hours rehearsing what he would say, rejecting speeches that sounded like complaints or pleas for sympathy in favor of simple facts that would speak for themselves. He would tell them about Sarah McKinnon's letter, Belle's breeding and training, and the remarkable abilities she had demonstrated. He would let them draw their own conclusions about what their mockery had revealed about their character rather than his. The Saturday before his planned departure, Ezra made final preparations. He packed his few belongings into saddlebags, secured Sarah McKinnon's letter and journal in the oilskin pouch, and spent a last evening in the cabin that had sheltered him through 10 years of reduced circumstances. Belle seemed to sense the significance of the approaching change. She stayed closer to him than usual, her attention focused on his activities with the intensity of someone preparing for an important journey. When he showed her the trail map by firelight, pointing out their intended route, she studied it with the careful attention of a partner rather than a mere animal. "Tomorrow we tell them the truth," Ezra said, folding the map and returning it to his saddlebag. "After that, we leave this place behind and find out what we can accomplish together." Belle lifted her head and looked at him directly, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. In that gaze, Ezra saw intelligence, loyalty, and something else, anticipation. She was ready for whatever came next, confident in their partnership and eager to discover the possibilities that lay ahead. The church bell would ring at 9 o'clock the next morning, calling the people of Millbrook to services. By 10 o'clock, they would know the truth about Belle and understand the magnitude of their misjudgment. By noon, Ezra and Belle would be on the trail, leaving behind a town that had never deserved either of them, and heading toward a future that promised recognition for their true worth. The church bell began its morning call at exactly 9 o'clock, its bronze voice carrying across Millbrook with the authority of established tradition. Ezra stood outside the white-painted building, Belle at his side, watching as the townspeople made their way along the wooden sidewalks toward Sunday services. He wore his only good shirt, freshly cleaned and pressed, and carried his father's cavalry saber in its leather scabbard, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of the honor he was about to defend. Martha Henderson was among the first to arrive, accompanied by her husband Charles and their 2 teenage children. She slowed when she saw Ezra, her expression shifting from surprise to concern as she recognized the gravity in his bearing. Charles, however, approached with the confident stride of a man accustomed to controlling situations through wealth and social position. "Thornfield," Charles said with forced joviality. "Surprised to see you here. Don't recall you being much for church attendance." "Got something important to say to everyone at once," Ezra replied quietly. "Seemed like the right place for it." Other townspeople were gathering now, their conversations dying as they noticed the unusual sight of Ezra and Belle positioned deliberately at the church entrance. Jimmy Morrison arrived with his usual crowd of followers, his face lighting up with anticipation as he realized he might be about to witness another entertainment at Ezra's expense. "Well, well," Morrison called out loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like the happy couple has come to renew their vows." The laughter that followed was automatic but nervous, as if people sensed something different about this encounter. Belle stood calmly beside Ezra, her attention focused on the gathering crowd, with the alert bearing of an animal prepared for anything. Reverend Phillips approached cautiously, clearly uncertain about how to handle the situation. Mr. Thornfield, if you wish to attend services, you're certainly welcome, but I'm not sure it's appropriate to bring—" "Belle stays with me," Ezra said firmly. "What I have to say concerns her as much as anyone." The crowd had swollen to nearly 50 people now, including most of the town's business owners and their families. Pete Hartley stood near his wife and children, his weathered face showing curiosity rather than the usual polite distance. Even the newer arrivals who had heard the story of Ezra's wedding but never witnessed the original event were pressing closer. Drawn by the promise of spectacle, Ezra stepped forward, his hand resting on the pommel of his father's saber. The gesture wasn't threatening, but it carried the weight of military bearing that commanded attention. "Most of you know me," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Know my circumstances, know what you think of me and my companion here. Before Belle and I leave Millbrook today, I thought you should know the truth about what you've been mocking all these months." A murmur ran through the crowd. Several people glanced at the saddled horse and packed supplies tied nearby, realizing that this wasn't just another humiliation to be endured, but a farewell address. "This letter," Ezra continued, producing the oilskin pouch from his coat, "was written by a woman named Sarah McKinnon. It tells the story of Belle's real origins and nature. With your permission, I'd like to read it to you." He didn't wait for permission, but began reading Sarah McKinnon's words in a clear, steady voice. As the letter progressed, describing Belle's breeding, training, and remarkable abilities, the crowd's laughter died away entirely. By the time he reached Sarah's description of Belle's loyalty and intelligence, an uncomfortable silence had settled. Over the gathering, Jimmy Morrison was the first to recover his voice. "That's a fine story, Thornfield, but anyone can write a letter claiming anything they want. Doesn't prove that old donkey is anything special." "You're right," Ezra agreed calmly. "Words alone don't prove anything." He looked at Belle, who had been following the conversation with obvious interest. "Belle, can you show them how you find water?" What happened next would be talked about in Millbrook for years to come. Belle stepped away from Ezra and began moving methodically around the churchyard. Her head lowered slightly, as if she were following a scent invisible to human senses. She paused at 3 different locations, pawing the ground and looking back. At Ezra expectantly. "There's a spring under the church," old Pete Hartley said suddenly, his voice carrying surprise and recognition. "My daddy helped dig the foundation 30 years ago. Hit water right about where that donkey's standing now." Belle moved to the second location she'd identified, near the edge of the churchyard, where the ground appeared completely dry. She pawed again and waited. "I'll be damned," Charles Henderson muttered, his businessman's skepticism warring with what he was witnessing. "There's a well there too. Been covered over so long most folks forgot about it." The crowd was pressing closer now, their mockery replaced by genuine curiosity and growing amazement. The demonstration of Belle's water-finding ability had shifted the crowd's mood from skepticism to fascination, but Jimmy Morrison wasn't ready to concede the validity of what they were witnessing. He pushed through the gathering to confront Ezra directly, his face flushed with the anger of a man whose entertainment was being ruined by inconvenient facts. "Parlor tricks," Morrison declared loudly. "Any old-timer could have told her where those water sources were. Doesn't prove she's anything more than a clever, trained animal." "You're right again," Ezra agreed with the same calm tone. "So let me show you something that can't be explained by tricks or prior knowledge." He reached into his saddlebag and retrieved the photograph Sarah McKinnon had left with her letter. The image was faded, but clear enough to show the younger Belle, standing proudly beside the McKinnons at their prosperous ranch. "This photograph was taken 15 years ago," Ezra announced, holding it where the crowd could see. "Belle was bred from champion stock, trained by people who understood her potential, and loved by a family who treated her as a member of their household." Martha Henderson stepped closer to examine the photograph, her expression showing recognition of the quality evident in the image. "That's the same animal," she said softly. "Look at her bearing, her condition. She was magnificent. "What happened to her?" asked Mrs. Hartley, her voice carrying the concern of a woman who had raised animals herself. "Hard times," Ezra replied simply. "Her family lost everything, just like families do. Belle was sold to pay debts, passed from owner to owner, each, one caring less about her welfare than the last. By the time she reached Millbrook, she'd been starved, neglected, and treated as worthless by people who couldn't recognize what they had." The crowd was murmuring now, and Ezra could see shame beginning to appear on some faces as people realized they had participated in the humiliation of a creature far superior to what they had assumed. But Jimmy Morrison wasn't finished. His face darkened with the particular rage of a man who realizes he's been made to look foolish in front of people whose opinion he valued. "Enough of this nonsense," he snarled, striding toward Belle with obvious intent to demonstrate that she was still just an animal regardless of her supposed pedigree. "I'll show you what your precious champion really is." Morrison raised his hand as if to strike Belle, and what happened next stunned everyone present into absolute silence. Belle didn't cower or retreat as might be expected from an animal accustomed to mistreatment. Instead, she moved with fluid grace to position herself between Morrison and Ezra, her small body radiating protective energy. But more than her physical stance, it was the transformation in Belle's entire demeanor that left the crowd breathless. Her head came up with the proud bearing Sarah McKinnon had described, her eyes focused on Morrison with intelligent assessment rather than fear. She didn't make a sound, but her message was unmistakable. She would not allow harm to come to someone under her protection. Morrison's hand froze in midair as he found himself staring into the dark eyes of an animal whose courage and nobility suddenly made his own behavior appear petty and cruel. The silence stretched until even the newest arrivals could feel the weight of the moment. "She's protecting him," whispered one of the children in the crowd, her young voice carrying clearly in the stillness. "Just like a person would," added another voice. Ezra stepped forward, placing his hand gently on Belle's neck. She relaxed slightly at his touch but remained alert, her attention still focused on Morrison. "This is what you mocked," Ezra said, quietly, his words carrying to every person present. "This loyalty, this courage, this capacity for love that asks nothing in return. You used her as a prop for your cruel entertainment, never realizing you were in the presence of something far better than most humans ever achieve." Morrison lowered his hand slowly, his face showing the confusion of a man whose worldview had just been thoroughly dismantled. He looked around at the crowd, seeking support or encouragement, but found only faces reflecting various degrees of shame and amazement. Reverend Phillips stepped forward, his young face serious with newfound understanding. "I owe you both an apology," he said formally. "What we did was wrong, regardless of what we thought we knew. There's nothing in Scripture that justifies using any of God's creatures for cruel amusement. We all owe them an apology," Martha Henderson added, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose social position gave weight to her words. "What happened here months ago was shameful. What we've witnessed today shows us just how shameful." Pete Hartley removed his hat, a gesture of respect that was immediately copied by most of the other men present. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Belle directly, "I'm sorry for how we treated you. You deserved better from all of us." The crowd began to disperse slowly, people speaking in low, thoughtful voices as they processed what they had witnessed. Children pointed at Belle with newfound respect, and several women approached to offer apologies and gentle touches that Belle accepted graciously. As the churchyard emptied, Ezra and Belle were left standing together in the morning sunlight, their vindication complete, but their departure imminent. The town that had mocked them now understood the truth, but that truth only confirmed that they belonged somewhere that could appreciate what they had to offer. 6 months after leaving Millbrook, Ezra stood on a ridge overlooking the valley that had become their new home, watching Belle graze contentedly in the meadow below. The morning sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and green, and the air carried the sweet scent of wildflowers and fresh water from the creek that meandered through their property. The journey from Millbrook had taken them through territories that few people had explored, guided by Belle's remarkable navigation abilities and Ezra's growing skill at reading the signs she provided. They had found work with a geological survey team, then with a group of settlers seeking safe passage through difficult terrain, and finally with a mining consortium that needed reliable guides who could locate water sources in seemingly barren country. Each job had built their reputation and their resources, until they were able to purchase this small ranch in a valley where neighbors measured worth by competence rather than past misfortunes. The property wasn't large, 40 acres of good grazing land with a solid cabin and outbuildings, but it represented something far more valuable than its modest size suggested. It represented a fresh start built on mutual respect and recognized ability. Belle had thrived in this new environment, her coat regaining the lustrous gray that marked her quality breeding. She moved with confidence now, her natural intelligence and training finally given scope for expression. The local ranchers had quickly recognized her value, often requesting Ezra's services specifically because Belle could locate water sources that conventional methods missed. But more than professional success, they had found something neither had experienced before: complete acceptance of who they were and what they represented together. Their partnership was no longer viewed as eccentric or amusing, but as practical and admirable. Local children rode out to watch Belle demonstrate her abilities, their parents treating both animal and man with the respect due to valued community members. Ezra descended the ridge and walked toward Belle, who raised her head from her grazing to acknowledge his approach. Around her neck, she wore a new leather collar that Ezra had crafted during the long winter evenings. Soft, well-oiled leather with their names tooled into the surface. Ezra and Belle, partners. It wasn't decorative frippery, but a symbol of the equality they had achieved in their relationship. "Morning, partner," Ezra said, running his hand along Belle's neck in the gesture that had become their daily greeting. She leaned into the contact, her dark eyes bright with contentment. A letter had arrived the previous day, forwarded through a network of postal contacts that Ezra maintained with his old life. The writing was Martha Henderson's, and its contents had stirred memories he thought he'd left behind in Millbrook. "Thought you should know," Martha had written, "that Jimmy Morrison left town 3 months after you did. Seems he couldn't live down the embarrassment of being faced down by a donkey in front of the whole congregation." The story of what Belle showed us that Sunday has become something of a legend here. Children especially love hearing about her courage and your dignity in the face of all our cruelty. Several of us have talked about what happened, and we're ashamed of how we behaved. Reverend Phillips has used your story in several sermons about recognizing worth in unexpected places and treating all of God's creatures with respect. I think you and Belle did more to improve this town's character in one morning than years of conventional preaching had managed. Pete Hartley asked me to tell you that if you ever decide to come back, you'd be welcomed with the respect you both deserve. But I suspect you've found better places and better people than what we could offer. I hope so. You both earned the right to be valued for what you truly are. Your friend, I hope I can call myself that, Martha. Ezra folded the letter and tucked it back into his shirt pocket. The knowledge that Millbrook had learned something from their encounter was gratifying, but it didn't stir any desire to return. That part of his life, the part defined by other people's judgment and expectations, was finished. Belle nudged his elbow, drawing his attention to the sound of approaching horses. 2 riders were coming up the valley trail, and Ezra recognized them as representatives from a cattle company based in Colorado. They'd sent word that they needed guides for a major drive through territory where water sources were scarce and poorly mapped. Exactly the kind of work that Belle's abilities made possible. "Looks like we've got visitors," Ezra told Belle, noting how her ears pricked forward with interest rather than wariness. She'd learned to enjoy meeting new people, confident now in her ability to assess their character and intentions. As the riders approached, Ezra reflected on the transformation that had brought them to this moment. Two creatures who had been discarded and dismissed by people who couldn't see past surface appearances had found each other and discovered possibilities neither could have achieved alone. Their partnership had grown from necessity to choice to something approaching family, a bond that transcended species and circumstance. The mock wedding that had been intended to humiliate them had become the foundation of the most honest relationship either had ever known. The cruelty meant to break their spirits had instead revealed strengths they hadn't known they possessed. The laughter that had followed them out of Millbrook had given way to the respect that greeted them everywhere they went now. Belle moved closer as the riders reached them, positioning herself where she could observe the newcomers while staying near Ezra. Her protective instincts remained strong, but they were informed now by confidence rather than fear. She knew her own worth and trusted in their partnership's ability to meet whatever challenges might arise. Looking at her, Ezra felt the deep satisfaction that comes from keeping faith with someone who has placed their trust in you completely. They had proven that friendship could grow from even the cruelest beginnings, that loyalty was stronger than mockery, and that recognition of true worth, once achieved, created possibilities limited only by imagination and courage. The future stretched ahead of them, full of trails yet to be explored and partnerships yet to be formed. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Two souls who had found in each other the respect and affection that made any journey worthwhile.